Welcome to Norse Code, the #1 podcast for your Minnesota Vikings. I'm your host with the moster, Dusty O'Connell. Joining me to my internet left, if I'm facing south, is Vikings blogger extraordinaire. He writes for 1500ESPN.com and Cold Omaha, and is also the host of the Wide Left podcast now. And he's Arif Hassan. How you doing, Arif?
Good, man. How are you?
I'm doing well. I enjoy switching up. Our customary method is to record shows late at night, and I occasionally enjoy switching it up. We're doing this one in the relatively early afternoon, and I think the sunshine has a beneficial effect on me. I should really get out more. Is the point?
Right. You should see the outside.
Yes, feel the burning sun on my face. Joining me to my internet right, again, if I am facing south, assuming you're still in Seattle, is at NFL Drafter on Twitter. He's the head of strategic intel at Oasis and a pro scout for Bleacher Report. Also does some college scouting stuff. Combine enthusiast and ranker of airports, Ethan Young. How you doing, Ethan?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me on, guys.
A genuine pleasure. We're looking forward to an exhaustive Combine recap. But first, I wanted to just tip our cap to our listeners and say that Norse Code is, as many know, not supported by advertising revenue or any one single patron. It is sponsored by you, the listener. Your contributions keep the lights on, keep the bits a-flowing, and allow us to do things like get awesome guests like Ethan. Although, I guess I should mention that we will not be paying you for your time, Ethan. I don't want to give you the wrong impression, but we're certainly glad you're here. And if you would like to, if any of the listeners out there would like to join the illustrious cabinet of Norse Code donors, of dedicated supporters, you can make a monthly contribution in any amount you'd like at patreon.com/NorseCode, or you can make a one-time contribution by going to paypal.me/NorseCode. So consider skipping the latte this month and spend that tree fitty on the #1 podcast for your Minnesota Vikings instead.
All right, so the NFL Combine just happened. I'm sure a lot of people have consumed any number of listicles about who won the Combine and who lost the Combine, but screw those, listen to us. We have a guy who has specialized in entering in Combine numbers into his little spreadsheet, just like I do in my little spreadsheet, and has his own system for evaluating not just the workout numbers that come in, but also the size measurements. So not just height and weight, but I think also hand size, arm length, and so on. It's like a whole system. Do you want to explain that a little bit?
Yeah. So Slytics stands for Size, Length, and Athleticism Analytics. We're just taking all the measurables that we can get from the Combine and Pro Days and trying to use them all to be creating these macro measurable composite formulas for each size, length, athleticism to bring it together and sort of describe the player, their measurable profile, so to speak.
Cool. So have you? So I assume that this is particularized for each position. Have you found that in your research that length matters more at some positions or not at other positions?
Yeah, absolutely. It's definitely position specific. The way I apply it is I create thresholds at each position with machine learning protocols, and that is how I sort of create thresholds for lower bound, upper bound. Sort of the guys below the lower bound is the guys that maybe you want to take off the board since they have such a low chance of hitting, and the guys above the upper bound are maybe the guys you want to consider moving up the board a little bit because they have such a high chance of success. Positions like edge rusher and defensive line are going to be the most successful in terms of because they're just such physical positions. But even some other positions like you wouldn't expect, wide receiver, tight end, running back, the skill positions, some say that measurable stuff really is important in there. Yeah. Not so much on the low end. Guys like Devonta Freeman and Arian Foster and LaShawn McCoy, Jamal Charles, those sort of different type of zone runners, but vision and anticipation and change of direction in the open field is sort of more important for those guys. But if you do have that elite skill set, guys like Adrian Peterson, Latavius Murray, LaDainian Tomlinson all sort of have the elite measurable skill sets. There's some other guys as well. I can pull up the whole list here for those top-end running backs, but you build a pretty interesting list of guys at the top that can be pretty successful. David Johnson.
So what you're saying is that, like, in the context of measurables, you can have situations where measurables can give you green lights, as it were, to like upgrade your round grade on a player, but they won't necessarily create as many red flags where you would take someone off your board because there have been enough successes with low measurables. So it's not like a linear process there.
No, absolutely not, and that's just at running back itself. Like defensive line and edge rusher, there's a lot of guys on the low end that you see them and you want to take them off the board. But at running back, it's more of a nice thing in terms of like if you're running a man or gap scheme. A lot of guys like David Johnson, Latavius Murray, Brandon Jacobs, all guys that Darren McFadden all tested really well in that upper group. Adrian Peterson, I'm sure you guys are very familiar with him.
So are there any situations where you've been like extremely surprised at how much or how little athleticism matters? Like, have you found, for example, like, oh my God, quarterbacks, they actually need more athleticism than we thought, or something like that? Like, is there any position, or maybe just like length, where you didn't think that like length mattered a lot and it does?
Yeah, so quarterback that's a great one to bring up. There's no sort of like upper bound threshold for quarterbacks, but there is a minimum one in terms of if you don't hit the minimum thresholds with Slytics, you're not going to be very successful in terms of the success rate for those guys. They have about a 7% success rate.
Are these guys that test poorly, like overall, or test poorly in a particular? Like, is there like a threshold failure for a particular workout, or you're just like, no, Ryan Mallett cannot move, so you probably shouldn't take him? Like,
it's not. It's not so much that. It's more so with machine learning, it's building thresholds for the whole profile rather than in a specific drill, and sort of grouping guys that way. Mallett's not a low-end guy, but, it's the quarterback threshold itself, when I've looked at it, is more size-based. So, the two guys that have beaten the lower bound are David Guard and Case Keenum. So not really two great guys there in terms of elite-level quarterbacks, but it did pick up David Carr, Brian Brom, Colt McCoy, Chad Henne, Chase Daniel, Matt Flynn, all guys that said were going to fail, and of course they did. Greg, guys like that, in terms of just not having the baseline size in their hands and their height and their weight and their arm length, all that put together to be successful quarterbacks in the league.
So as one example, like Russell Wilson, for a lot of people, might not have hit their thresholds because they use thresholds for each individual workout, but Slytics might have given him an upgrade for his hand size and his athleticism that overall as a composite score would have brought him back up above, a threshold that a normal like 5'10" quarterback wouldn't have hit.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great example because a lot of people point to Russell Wilson as sort of the outlier there. And in terms of what I do, he's really not. He tested very average in terms of his entire profile with the big hands and the athleticism, as you mentioned. Yeah, he's a great guy to sort of there's more to it that meets the eye in terms of you don't want to just, raw position drills, it's height, right? You want to build that whole macro measurable profile. And I think that's the best way to sort of describe in terms of predictive success.
Okay, awesome. So this should give us like a pretty good segue into a discussion about the NFL Combine. We also had a couple of Pro Day results roll in, which I don't know if you've entered them in, but I'm sure you've got like a pretty good intuitive understanding of like, how well, Joe Mixon did, because that's all the friggin' timeline would talk about, including me. So, I'm part of the problem.
Yeah.
But let's just talk about the Combine in general. The Vikings are interested potentially in a running back. Vikings fans are interested in a running back. It's probably not going to happen early on, but it is an interesting discussion. The guy that I think a lot of people were pretty disappointed in was Dalvin Cook. Is there something that, based off of what you've seen so far, before we can get Pro Day results, that might modify things, that would tell you, and I know you said that running backs, inherently the low threshold is just not as important, but is there something there that would tell you that, Dalvin Cook's workouts are a problem?
Yeah, no, that's exactly what we were talking about before is, with those zone runners, I'm not really worried about how they're testing so much. And Dalvin's a great example of that. He didn't jump well. Really, there was a couple of drills he really struggled in. But for me, that's not as important. He tested very similarly to me that LaShawn McCoy did. He actually tested a little bit worse, but in terms of that profile, it's very similar. And, McCoy's obviously had plenty of success, and Devontae Freeman tested even worse than Dalvin Cook did.
Yeah.
So, there's definitely an archetype for being a zone runner. If you're a gap schemer, a power man runner, you don't really want to test like that. There's not as many examples. Michael Turner's sort of the only one on the low end there. And obviously a guy like Leonard Fournette, who didn't test so well. Right. He kind of bowed out of all the agility stuff, and that kind of scares you based on how he jumped. That one raised a lot more of a red flag to me than Dalvin, just because of his running style in terms of those zone runners.
Okay, are there any running backs that did stand out to you besides, maybe, I guess negatively, maybe Leonard Fournette? Like, were there, for example, Alvin Kamara jumped through the roof. TJ Logan put up some pretty good testing numbers in general. Christian McCaffrey did pretty well, but he only had 10 bench reps. He came in at 205. What are the running backs that stood out to you? Yeah,
McCaffrey definitely stood out for the agility stuff. He blew everybody out of the water with his, I think it's 3-cone.
Yeah, his 3-cone was like a 6.54. Is insane.
Yeah, that was insane. And Kamara was a guy on tape I didn't really expect him to test well, based on what I saw with him. I saw him being more of a below average tester. I didn't think he would jump all that well. You could see he had the long speed, and I thought he'd do well in the change of direction stuff because of his balance. Mm-hmm. But he killed it. And Elijah Hood tested pretty well. I think. Let me pull up the sheet here. I got to pull up the sheet.
I remember all 300 players, man.
Yeah, the recall of that stuff comes and goes.
Sure. Well, sure. While you're pulling up Elijah Hood, did you get any sense on was it Samaje Perine? I think is how you pronounce his name. He's a guy that Vikings fans might be interested in.
Yeah. He didn't run very well. If you're looking at pure 40, he ran like a 4.6. But the bench reps, he put up 30 bench reps,
right?
Which that's almost like fullback numbers.
It's Jerick McKinnon numbers.
Yeah, it's crazy. And I liked him on tape too. He's a guy that's going to be, in terms of between the tackles, power running, right? Sort of that complement to maybe McKinnon in that offense. They're very different runners. P-Run's 233, obviously.
Yeah.
But I think they could complement each other pretty well. I know they were interested in him at the Pro Day. I think that's one of the reasons they were down there, was to see him. Mm-hmm. But they could complement each other really well. McNichols was another guy. I really did not like Jeremy McNichols' tape. But he tested a lot better than I anticipated. He jumped 35.5, 6'9", 3-cone. The big issue I had with him on tape was the vision, but I didn't think he was that great of an athlete either. You could see him running into the backs of his offensive linemen at times at Boise State. So, the vision is obviously the biggest question there. But I was really surprised with how he tested.
Yeah, fair enough. I think moving beyond that, there's obviously a big hole for the Vikings along their offensive line. Does Slittix take into account age? Because I think the biggest question for someone like Garrett Bowles is he's going to finish his rookie year at 25 and a half years old, I think. He's a very old offensive lineman, even for an offensive lineman who entered the draft a little bit older than a lot of other positions. Does Slittix take into account age, or how do you answer these questions when you've got say Laquan Treadwell or Teddy Bridgewater who entered the draft at 20, or Danielle Hunter who entered the draft at 20, or someone like Garrett Bowles or Danny Watkins is a pretty good example of a guy who basically aged out of the NFL. Does that impact things? Because Bowles had an amazing workout.
Yeah, Bowles did test really well. Slittix doesn't take into account age in its thresholds, but it is something I look at as an evaluator on this. When I'm factoring in that sort of stuff on my board. And obviously, Bowles coming in, you can't hope for as much development as say you would with a Danielle Hunter, right, when he's 5 years older. Mm-hmm. But yeah, Bowles really impressed. Another guy I really liked how he tested was Nico Saragusa.
He tested really well.
Yeah, I did not anticipate that based on his tape at all. He kind of seemed like a boxy guy that kind of struggled to move in space on tape. But he really killed the agility drills for what he was supposed to do.
And were there any not that quarterbacks are that important for Vikings fans, but there were any quarterbacks that hit that 7% success rate threshold that you're worried about?
Yeah, so I haven't run those full numbers yet. I'm waiting for the official sheet. to kind of solidify all those things. The guy that I thought was really interesting with the quarterbacks was Trevor Knight. He tested like a receiver. He ran a 4.54, had a great vertical 35.5, was okay in the agility stuff too. His short shuttle was 4.14. And you put his numbers up with Mohamed Sanu, who also has a quarterback background. They're almost exactly alike. So in terms of converting him to a receiver, I think that's something that you might see happen here. Get some looks. I don't know what he did today at the pro day. I'm sure he just threw. It would be interesting to hear if he had done receiver drills at all. But in terms of the measurable profile, he tested a lot like a receiver. So I thought that was really interesting.
Cool. Yeah, no, I think a lot of teams were interested in him as a receiver or as a potential tight end. So that's interesting. I just wanted to ask that quarterback question out of the way before I got more of these offensive line questions in there, just because that's always curious to me. So guys that I was kind of interested in that I thought tested well for the positions that seem to have historically mattered for them. Forrest Lamp, Ethan Posick, Taylor Moton. How do you evaluate how their workouts went?
Let's see. I'm looking at Lamp's numbers here. The bench obviously stands out at 34. If that's something, he didn't jump as well. He didn't crack the 30 that you saw.
His vert wasn't very good. His broad was pretty good.
The broad was good, but the vert, you didn't see him crack 28 like some of the other guys did. Mm-hmm. So somebody jumped really well the offensive line. I think somebody cracked 31. Who was that? That was Antonio Garcia. He jumped.
Oh yeah.
I could see the Vikings targeting Garcia sort of in round 2. Sort of after the first 3 guys go, there's sort of a hole there at tackle. And, it might be a reach sort of where they're drafting to pick him, but I think there's a huge gap between Garcia and the next guy at tackle, too. So in terms of, it might be smart in terms of maximizing on the scarcity of that market, even in free agency as well, to grab him there.
Yeah, no, that's going to be a really interesting spot for Vikings fans, just because of the way the tackle market shakes out. Now, obviously, people could fall, but I think that essentially, at the most optimistic for each of these players, there's maybe, if you're really high on Taylor Moton, he's a guy you could put there. Antonio Garcia, like you said. People seem to hate Roderick Johnson, but he keeps on showing up in these big media boards at around that spot, around the 50, 48 spot. And so he's another guy that, as a tackle might be interesting. Forrest Lamp, it really depends on whether or not you see him as a guard or as a tackle. I would be really interested in Forrest Lamp playing tackle just in general, just because of how well he did it. But I have no idea sort of how strictly those thresholds are enforced for the NFL. But it sounds like that's not going to be a thing for him. What do you think about Lamp transitioning from tackle, where he played phenomenally, to guard in the NFL?
Yeah, I love Lamp on tape. He's one of my top 10 guys on my board right now overall. I really like what he offers. I have him great as a guard, but I think he can hold his own at tackle. It's more, I just don't think the NFL will give him a chance.
Would you rather have him be a great guard that you think that he might be, or a pretty good tackle that he may end up being? At what point do you say he's more valuable at guard than at tackle?
Yeah, it's sort of the Justin Pugh question. I think the Giants answered that they want the guard. In terms of having the versatility, though, it's nice if your right tackle gets injured, you can slide him out there. And with the Vikings, obviously they had a lot of that last year. It would have been nice to have somebody that could slide out. Alex Boone sort of has that background. To have another guy that can do that inside would be nice at right guard. I think I would want to put him at guard just because of how dominant he could be in there. You look at Zach Martin and the impact he has on the Cowboys offense. I think there's a lot there to like. Roderick Johnson, you talked about him a little bit. I think the reason he keeps showing up in these boards is the arm length, 36-inch arms. In terms of arm length in general, it's sort of an interesting discussion because everybody points to Joe Thomas as the outlier there in terms of having really short arms. But what's interesting about that is, he was listed at 32.5-inch arms, but Mitchell Schwartz's team.
Yeah, Mitchell Schwartz just tweeted out.
Yeah. He recently tweeted out that was an incorrect measurement. He actually has 34-inch arms, which are above average. So that would be a very sort of, not earth-shattering, but would kind of change the whole mindset behind arm length, I believe.
Right, in terms of he's the guy, right?
Right, yeah, he is. He is the guy. And it's not that having 36-inch arms like Roderick Johnson is going to be it's not a big board, right? You don't want to pick the tackle with the longest arms. But in terms of looking at it in a threshold situation, it does sort of change your perception and how you look at arm length, I think.
Does that, there's not very many snaps that we get to evaluate like tackles versus receivers. I think that the sample size for us to use as like an output is pretty limited, right? And so you've got a couple of really great tackles, at the top that might kind of impact the way that, you run, say, like machine learning.
Absolutely, yeah.
Does that information like kind of screw with things a bit? Are there enough tackles with like shorter arms that kind of balance out the Joe Thomas example, or are we just kind of, like what's the deal there?
No, I could pull up the whole set here and take a look at historically what you're asking. But I do know that Joe Thomas is he's a premier tackle. So I mean he's like the hard and fast example of it not mattering. I think there was a couple guys like Jeff Backus didn't test well at all back in the day. He was a solid tackle for a couple years. He's sort of the outlier in the work I do, because Joe Thomas is a mid-tier guy for me. But Backus fell below everything he did, and he's sort of like the exception to the rule. I'm pulling up all the arm length here. I could take a look at who had short arms other than Joe Thomas.
See, I think because I've got a spreadsheet in front of me too. I think Jordan Gross, it looks like he's got 32 and a quarter inch arms. That's pretty short.
He was a good player.
Yeah. I'm looking for guys below 33. There's just not that many below 33 specifically. But at 33, there's Jared Valdir, who, he turned in a pretty solid career.
You got guys, you have Valdir at 33, and you have King Dunlap. I mean, he's an okay guy at 32.25, and he does stick at tackle. Eric Winston was 32.25, and he was pretty good for a couple of years. He bounced around, but he's in Cincinnati now, right?
Yeah, I think so. No, because the weird thing about Cincinnati is that they drafted 2 tackle and tried not to play them for as long as possible.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. Yeah, there's not too many. I think a lot of that is just because the NFL won't play him there more so.
Yeah, so that was going to be my next question, is that we don't have a lot of examples of tackles with short arms, people like with 33-inch arms or below, playing well at tackle, but we also probably don't have that many examples of them playing tackle at all. So how do you deal with that kind of problem in the data where you can't test a bias that the NFL might have because the NFL is not allowing us to get the data to test that bias?
Yeah, it's really a tough question. It's sort of a trial and error sort of scenario in terms of you kind of have to play to what you're given. And with that, in terms of saying, okay, well, what does the data say on Forrest Lamp playing tackle? It really doesn't say anything. And you got to sort of project it from an evaluation standpoint in terms of, okay, do you think he has, does he have the strength outside his frame to play tackle, in terms of holding the guys across the outside hip with a great, burst. It's sort of you got to go to some other factors rather than just looking at the historical data.
Yeah, so that's going to create a lot of interesting problems. It also affects the nature of the tackle versus the guard market. It just seems like both in free agency and the draft, the guard market is just so much richer. And I get tricked every year by the draft. Every year I'm just like, the guard market is like, there's pretty good depth among guards in this class. And then that's just like not true. There's like a guard deficiency in the NFL for like a reason. But it seems like, maybe I'm going to get tricked again, it seems like in this class there's a bunch of guards that could end up turning into quality players or who are already quality players. It seems like in free agency this year, there's a couple of guards you could definitely talk yourself into. Like, it's not just Ronald Leary or TJ Lang or Kevin Zietler, but there's like people below that that would be definitely, upgrades for the Vikings, would be viable starting guards. People like Larry Warford, for example, that occupy kind of like a second or third tier in that market. Like, it seems like tackle is just going to be a scarcer market both in free agency and the draft. Does it make sense for the Vikings to reach on a tackle? Like, let's say Antonio Garcia is gone, and Ryan Ramczyk, Cam Robinson are gone. Does it make sense for the Vikings to reach on a tackle there because of the nature of the market, and then just maybe find a way to pick up that value later by getting an undervalued guard?
Yeah, it's definitely going to be tough if Garcia's gone to find a startable tackle week one. You might have to do something like pick up like a Sebastian Vollmer type, right, and just plug him at right tackle and just take the L at left tackle with Clemens, which obviously wouldn't be ideal. But yeah, there are a lot of guards that could start. There's some veteran guys Jonathan Cooper's sort of an intriguing guy as a younger option. Chris Chester and Jari Evans might retire, but if they come back, they're serviceable. Chance Warmack's sort of similar to Jonathan Cooper in terms of he flashed on tape early on in the year with Tennessee, but got hurt so early. What are you getting there? And he's been so up and down in his career. But he could be an interesting buy low option for a team that sort of runs more that power gap scheme. The guy I really liked for Minnesota was Eric Kush, who's now back with the Bears. They took him off the market pretty early. I thought that would have been a nice sort of guard center guy, sort of in that Joe Berger mold of guys, long term, and sort of he could slide in at right guard, and then when Berger moves on, could kind of be that rotational piece inside. But the Bears got a great deal on him, so unfortunately he's not available. But I think Warford's going to be the premier option on that guard market, even though I think he's the fourth best of the group because of his age. He's only 25. Right. So somebody like the Dolphins, I think, is going to just come in and pay him a buttload. And guys like Leary, who are a little bit older, and Lang with the medical might be a little bit more undervalued relative, even though on tape they didn't really flash some of the same consistency that Warford didn't flash the same consistency that those guys had.
Yeah. Well, speaking of the center guard transitions, what do you do with a guy like Posick who what is he, 6'7", 6'6"? I think he measured in at just above 6'6".
Yeah.
Who is really tall for a center. We watched him at the Senior Bowl. I thought that he played really, really well at center. He had some issues at guard, but that just might be I haven't really played this in a while sort of thing. What do you do with a guy like him? So if the Vikings, re-sign Berger for one more year, it sounds like, he's considering retirement. But if they get him for one more year, Ethan Posick is there at a really good value, say in the third round somehow. Do you draft him, play him at guard for a year, and then have him take over for center in the long run? What do you think about a guy like him?
Yeah, I think that that's not a horrible plan. He looked pretty rough in the Senior Bowl reps there. Not as rough as Morgan from Kutztown in terms of transitioning to guard. I mean, that guy didn't
like that dude at all.
His footwork was horrible. He couldn't even pull. He wouldn't step far enough back on his pull, and he'd run into the center. It was embarrassing. He played a lot better in the game, but at times he just looked like he'd never played center in his life. And at game speed, that's going to get exposed. And Posick wasn't quite that bad, but it was a little rough transition there. I think having the tall center is okay if you have a quarterback that's tall. Like for Seattle, you don't want to put Posick in there because Russell Wilson's 5'11". If you Sam Bradford, what's Sam Bradford, 6'3"?
I think he's 6'4", but I'm not entirely sure.
I don't think that's as much of a problem with someone like Bradford. Obviously, Posick's a good player inside. I think you can stick him at center. There are some taller centers. I can pull that up too. I think there are a couple successful taller centers that have been able to stick inside, especially recently, in terms of just raw height. But a lot of those coaches do want the shorter sort of mold. Like Cameron Irving was really tall, and they moved him to guard, and he struggled.
So because he played every position at Florida State, right? He played tackle and he was bad. He played guard and he was bad. He played center and I guess he was phenomenal. Then the Browns drafted him, and then they kept on not playing him at center. Do you think it's only because of the height thing?
No, well, I mean, I did NFL 1000 this year. I graded guards and centers, and he did play some center, and he was pretty brutal this year. You could make an argument he was the worst center in the league overall. But in terms of Mitch Morse is pretty tall. Guys like Travis Swanson are pretty tall. He's 6'5". Mike Pouncey's 6'5".
Mike Pouncey's 6'5"? Oh, okay.
Yeah. Joe Berger's pretty tall. There's a couple guys like that have stuck inside. With all those guys, though, they do have the bigger quarterbacks. That's, I think, one reason why Max Unger was traded from Seattle. He's 6'5" as well. And they moved on from him, and I think a lot of that had to do with Russell Wilson and his height just not being compatible.
I hadn't considered that. That's really interesting.
Yeah, because Max Unger is a really good player and sort of anchored that Seattle line. That's sort of when it went into a tailspin is when they lost him. But, yeah, they just didn't match up, and you can't move on from Wilson, obviously.
Cool. So So with all of that in mind, who are the offensive linemen that you think really cemented themselves as guys worthy of like upgrading from the film grade based on the workouts that you saw, or based on the workouts that we have?
We talked about Saragusa a little bit. I think that's the biggest one because it sort of just changed the perception of how he moves in space. And because, on the gap stuff, when they're pulling him at San Diego State, he's facing off against these Mountain West kids that are, 40 pounds less than him, and they're not NFL athletes. So seeing that he can move in space and handle himself that way is pretty intriguing for his long-term development. He would be the one I'd say stands out.
Yeah, well, I know I was watching a little bit of him. I was mostly watching Donnell Pumphrey. It's actually difficult to find a bunch of Saragusa tape that isn't just Donnell Pumphrey tape. But I was watching him before the Senior Bowl, and I thought that he was really inconsistent about his pulling, because I thought there were times when he was pulling, and he was pulling really well. He hit his landmarks really well. He was moving quicker. He beat linebackers to the spot and stuff like that. And then there were other times where he just one time he ran into a dude, which is always frustrating, I think.
Yeah, right. That's not what you want.
Yeah, and then, other times, again, he kind of missed his landmarks and stuff like that. He was pretty inconsistent. But one thing that I found was interesting is I didn't get to see enough of his pass protection. I was reading the scouting reports that people put together, but he wasn't necessarily that good of a pass protector. I was running the numbers that Pro Football Focus gave to us from all the players at the Senior Bowl, and I was adjusting those numbers for, the offense, basically team sack rate, essentially, in order to, take care of the fact that some offenses are fast and some offenses are slow, and that helps your sack rate. And his numbers are actually pretty phenomenal as a pass protector. As a guy who is known to be a very good run blocker, a guy whose numbers indicate, I don't know if he is, he might actually just have a raw technique and he's playing against Mountain West kids, but a guy whose numbers, indicate a pretty good, pass protector, and a guy whose tests are pretty phenomenal. Is this a guy that you'd be comfortable upgrading by maybe an entire round if you're an NFL team?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And in terms of the pass protection, too, you see the flashes on tape. When they stunt inside, he's great upper body strength outside his frame to kind of hold those guys, even though he doesn't have a set base. So I think he flashes a lot of potential in there, too. I mean, he's just a big, strong guy, and in terms of when you can get it going in a direction, it's going to be going, it's going to be hard to stop. The footwork and stuff needs to probably be cleaned up a little bit, but, he's just so powerful that he can get away with that. Maybe against two gapping types, not so much in the NFL. But, yeah, I really liked how he tested. It sort of changed my perception on him as a whole. And I definitely would be moving him up my board.
Is there a moment when you see a particular test for an offensive lineman where, and I know that this is more about composite scores, but say an offensive lineman puts up 8 reps on the bench press, are you just you know what, I don't really care how quick his 3-cone is. I don't think he's going to be able to make up for this in my mind. Is there a test or a threshold for a test where you feel pretty strongly about that?
Yeah, in terms of bench, that's the biggest thing that would scare me. There's a work ethic thing. The guy's not putting in the time to prepare for the combine, and I mean he's a big strong guy. He should be able to rep 225 more than 8 times. I don't think there was anybody at the combine that really put up an embarrassing bench. Somebody put up 15. Sam Tevy from Utah. I haven't watched his tape, but I wouldn't say that's anything embarrassing. The guy that really scared me from how he tested was David Sharp from Florida. He's 340, big guy, but really did not test well in the jumping portions. Only jumped 20 inches. His broad was less than 100 inches. Okay agility for his size, though. So that was interesting. But just in terms of raw power, you'd like to see more from that size. In terms of,
Do you think that's so? I think at Florida, and I'm not confident about this. I really should be watching more of these guys. I think at Florida he played tackle, but he's projected to play guard in the NFL. But if it's explosiveness or power where he's struggling, but agility where he's winning, do you think that maybe you could just be you know what? I know that his skill set seems to translate better to guard, but I'd rather him be my backup tackle. Do you think that that's what you'd if you were advising an NFL team based off of the test that you saw? Do you think that maybe that's a recommendation that you'd put forward for a guy like David Sharp?
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense in theory. I'd like to see how, the agility stuff translates to tape in terms of his footwork. I've not watched a lot of David Sharp. But I think a lot of the things is people just see the raw weight and go, oh, he's a guard, right? And there are definitely guys that do not project better inside. Like Jason Spriggs, he's not weight, but he does not project. There's a lot of tackles that do not project better inside. It's not the sort of take a bad tackle and put him inside. That doesn't always work. So he could definitely be a guy. I'd have to analyze him a little bit deeper. But definitely based on the testing scores, I think that's something you can look at. It's definitely a question that it raises. And I think that's a lot of the value of looking at these testing scores in terms of a raw standpoint, is you can see it can sort of give you theories about, okay, let's go look in the tape and see if this is, how this translates.
Yeah, that makes sense. Let's go to the receivers real quick. The Vikings might get a receiver to fill out the bottom of the roster or the top, depending on, what happens with like Cordell Patterson, and they trade Jarius Wright and they don't extend Charles Johnson or whatever. There were a ton of receivers at this year's Combine. I mean, it felt like there were more this year than in most years. Maybe I'm wrong.
There's 58.
Yeah, a ton of receivers.
Crazy.
With that number of receivers in mind, it's pretty difficult for someone to just stand out. Did anyone stand out negatively or positively to you based off of the Slidic process?
I was really expecting Isaiah Ford to test poorly. I mean, I've made a list of guys before the Combine that said, okay, these guys are going to test poorly in terms of what I was anticipating. And Isaiah Ford actually tested a lot better than I thought. I was really expecting him to go out and just do really bad. And he held his own. People thought Malachi Dupree was going to go blow up the Combine. He really didn't. He ran pretty well. I heard he was going to jump 42 inches. He jumped 39, so certainly respectable. Yeah, it's certainly good, but sort of it didn't really meet the hype. Had a really good broad, though. Sort of the agility stuff is where he was just average, which is sort of what you anticipated coming in. My issues with him are more on tape in terms of his inconsistencies with his hands and things like that. But Matt Collins is a guy I really liked on tape. He tested pretty well. Didn't complete full testing because of his injuries, but he ran a good 40. And he's just walking around the facility. You see Matt Collins walking around. He's 6'4", 220 guy, and long arms, big hands, and he runs in a straight line like that. It sort of intrigues you on day 3. That could be an interesting target for the Vikings.
I've never heard of this guy in my life. Who does he play for?
Matt Collins, North Carolina.
Oh, I thought you said Matt Collins.
No. Matt Collins out of North Carolina.
Okay, yeah, actually, North Carolina brings up an interesting question that is not related to the Vikings, but is still super interesting. So you've got Bug Howard, Matt Collins, and Ryan Switzer at wide receiver. Do you think that this could be... So Mitch Trubisky is a guy that, some people are talking up, some people don't like as much. But he seems to have a very talented cast, and not to mention his running back, very talented cast around him. Is this a situation where you're like, hey man, Zach Mettenberger didn't exactly light up the stat sheet with OBJ and Jarvis Landry and Jeremy Hill, plus, some pretty good offensive linemen. Mitch Trubisky, he's a one-year starter, and he's being talked up as a first-round prospect, but it's not like he's got, these amazing efficiency numbers or anything like that. And he's got, these guys that are either athletic wonders or really friggin' fantastic college players that might end up being, really good in the NFL. What's the deal there, do you think?
Yeah, that was actually something I noted when I was grading Trubisky, is just how much talent he has around him. And not only the talent, you talk about the 3 receivers, the running back, and they have some young guys that are pretty interesting athletes as well, but the scheme they're in, Larry Fedora, it's a very high-paced, easy concept offense, a lot of simple stuff that's not really going to translate well to the league. That said, when Trubisky was given those sort of more complicated concepts, his anticipation in throwing windows is pretty good. He can anticipate when guys are going to break. The issue I have with him is more mechanical. With Trubisky, I think his arm path is a mess. People talk about the footwork, and I think that's an issue too. But in terms of his arm path, I think he's got to be completely remapped from a mechanic standpoint. And I don't think that's something that can happen in the NFL. And that's the sort of thing you got to take a year or two and really sit down and do something like weighted balls or something like that in terms of remapping in how he throws from the top down. And in today's NFL, you don't have that time for that sort of development, especially in the first round.
Yeah, that makes sense. Were there any receivers that bottomed out for you that either you were not high enough going in for you to give them leeway and they didn't give you that kind of leeway at the Combine, or just had such a bad performance that you decided, hey, some people were talking about them, but let's move on?
Yeah, I haven't run the full slicks numbers on the receivers yet, but a guy that I was really interested to see was Artavis Scott because of his medical.
Right.
He looked really explosive in the open field before the injury, and then not so much after. And he really did not test well. We ran a 4.62 for a guy of his size at 193. Not ideal. Jumped okay, and the agility stuff where you really wanted to see him blow it up, he didn't. So that was sort of disappointing to see in terms of, okay, well, the medical is clearly an issue in terms of how he moves in space.
All right, then the final offensive position would be tight ends. Pretty phenomenal class, both like in terms of ability and also in terms of athletic talent. I'm just going to leave you with that. Tee off on the tight ends. Talk about who you want, how much you want.
I'll start with a very underrated name. Is John Smith from Florida International. I really liked him on tape. You see, he's a prototypical move tight end. He's sort of undersized 6'2", 250 guy. Runs sort of the rubs and drags really well. But he tested amazing. Ran a 4.6, 4.63. Did really on a bench jump 38 inches, which is sort of the explosion you don't really see from move tight ends. He didn't do a 3-cone, but the short shuttle was really impressive. I wasn't expecting him to test one. I did really like his tape, but really sort of changed my perception on him in terms of that. After the catch, that's where he does really well, and the numbers back that up. But in terms of maybe even being a red zone threat a little bit with how well he jumped, that was really impressive. And obviously, Michael Roberts' hands are the biggest ever for their position at 11.5.
11.5, yeah.
Yeah. So he's crazy. Not great in space in terms of agile. Wouldn't really fit, I think, what the Vikings do. They already have like David Morgan, who I really liked last year from UTSA, and sort of that mold. And I don't think they would get him. And then Adam Shaheen, he was almost 280 from Ashland, 280 pounds, and he ran a 4.79. Crazy stuff. And you almost think you would want to put more 10 more pounds on him and see if he can play tackle with how athletic he is in this class, because there's just so many tight ends and no offensive line help. But
actually not a terrible idea, honestly.
Well, yeah,
I'm just thinking, like, Seahawks do it all the time. We've even had some successes. I think wasn't Jason Peters a tight end in college?
Yeah, absolutely. Jason Peters is the big one. George Fant, right? He's the big hope. We got to see if he pays off. But
I still think he's a power forward first, tight end second, tackle third. I don't know if that counts.
Oh no, absolutely. But yeah, he still. I think he still played more basketball than football in his life. So, George Kittle from Iowa. I don't know if you're familiar with him up there. And
some people have been talking about him. He's supposed to be this fantastic blocker too, right? Second best or third best blocker in the draft.
I would argue behind O.J. Howard, he is the best blocker in the tight end class, and he's a mauler, and he came in and tested like he's a yard after catch guy. He ran a 4.53, which is crazy for a guy that's a mauler, a little bit undersized. He's 248, 247, but he jumped really well. The agility stuff he really killed. He ran a 6.58 and a 4.16 in the agility in the short shuttle and 3-cone.
God.
Yeah, and this is a guy that is a mauler. So is
there?
Those are O.J. Howard's numbers. I was looking at them.
Okay. Okay. Well, I've got my own set of O.J. Howard questions, but I'm already in love with him anyway. But tell me more about this George Kittle guy.
Yeah. So, the way he tested did not match how he played at all, because he jumped 35 inches. The broad was 132 inches, which was insane. It put up 18 bench reps, which is respectable, but the 4.52 is really what stood out to me, because you don't see him as a dynamic vertical guy. You see him as a guy that's going to seal off double teams and things like that as an inline guy, but he tested like he can be a dynamic threat down the field.
Cool. Well, let's talk about O.J. Howard. So the book on him, a lot of people know it pretty well, is that he's primarily used as a blocker in Alabama. He didn't really show up except evidently in national championship games and the college football playoffs in general. But it seemed like, Alabama didn't want to use him that much as a receiver. When they did use him as a receiver, he was very much catch underneath, get some yards after the catch kind of guy. But when he did have the opportunity to actually, run actual routes, he seemed like a very good route runner to me. He seemed like he was a guy that could be a 3-level threat as a tight end, and then also he's this really gifted blocker both from a technical and physical standpoint. But why is there a disconnect between what it seems like are his traits as a pass catching tight end and his production? And should we be concerned about that?
I wouldn't be. I think a lot of that's the function of the offense. I mean, we were sitting up there in Mobile the first day of practice, and 2 plays in, O.J. Howard made a one-handed catch and sort of made the statement that he's the best player there. And I think that I don't think that's wrong. I don't think there's anybody there that really throughout the week proved they were better. I was initially scared. He only jumped 30 inches, which was not great, but he did respectable in the broad, so that sort of alleviated some of those concerns. And then obviously the 40 he ran at 4.51. And his size is just incredible. And the agility numbers I mentioned earlier when I was talking about Kittle, those were his just exceptional numbers for 250. 6'5" guy, he's not probably going to be a vertical guy in terms of red zone throw him in a fade, just on how he jumps and how he plays on tape too. That's not really how he wins. But he's strong at the catch point. Runs good routes. I think put him in line and he's going to kill guys as a blocker. I mean that's where he really shines. I mean he there's no question that he could just fly. And he's not going to put on. He's not scared to take a hit, and he's going to bury guys.
Where do you have him ranked? Not just among the tight ends, but in the class overall.
I can pull up my whole board here. I have Howard. Out of the guys I've graded, Howard is 7th on my board. Overall.
All right. Yeah. No. Because so the phrase I use when I describe Howard, and I really hate using it because people use it every year, and it's kind of lost a lot of meaning, and it is used a lot to great hyperbole, but I do think that he's a generational prospect at tight end. It is at a position that doesn't have as much value as a lot of other positions, so, what do you do with that? But to me, he's probably the best tight end that we've seen come through the draft in a while. Do you want to talk me down, or are you on board?
No, I'm there with you. I think the only thing that sort of changes that is how great the tight end class is in terms of... If he had
we didn't even talk about Njoku.
Or Evan Ingram.
Or Evan Ingram.
Yeah, I mean... Yeah. It's an insane class. Gerald Everett didn't test exceptional, but another guy I really like on tape. It's a great tight end class, and especially when you throw in like guys like Johnny Smith we talked about earlier and George Kittle. But
what do you do if you're the Vikings? Because the Vikings basically have the tight end position figured out. They're overpaying Kyle Rudolph, but he did just have a career year.
Yeah.
And Red Ellison, we have an injury concern with him, but he's fundamentally a good player. David Morgan's there, but it's really difficult not to be enchanted by this tight end class, where in the 4th or 5th round you can get a guy that in other years might have gone in the 2nd round, which for a tight end is actually pretty good. Like a lot of tight ends that are at the top of the class go in the 2nd round. What do you do if you're the Vikings? Do you think you've got 3 tight ends, some concerns about one of them, some money concerns with another one, but fundamentally a position that seems set?
Yeah, there'd be an interesting team to take a look at Jake Butt because he's not going to be able to play much this year in terms of the medical, but he could be a nice value for them in terms of if they move on from Rudolph next year, being ready to slide in because of the medical, and he'll be way down the board because of the strength of the class and tearing up his knee in the bowl game.
Totally forgot about him. He was like tight end 1 going in.
Yeah, I mean, he could be a great value for them, and I don't think the Vikings really have that many needs. It's sort of other than the offensive line, obviously that's a pressing one, but.
Their needs are obvious, I think, is the...
Yeah, they don't really have a lot of hidden needs in terms of, their front, they're pretty set. The receivers, they have a lot of guys. If they let some of the guys they have go, they could maybe use some depth there. They could use a running back. They could use... but it's not like they need any edge rushers or linebackers, which is where this class is edge is pretty strong. Corner is where this class is strong. And, they've invested heavily in corner over the last couple of years. They could maybe use another body there. But and they could get good value at corner late on as well. But Jake Butt would be an interesting fit for them based on this is sort of a year they can take the luxury of taking a medical guy because the needs aren't as pressing in terms of filling that need for the future. And with Rudolph already in place, they don't need the immediate impact.
Sure. Well, let's switch to the other side of the ball. Before one last thing, your favorite offensive player in terms of just combine performance alone. Who do you got? Is it Siragusa, or what do you got? Evan Ingram?
It might be, in terms of just their perception of how I saw them versus how they performed, would be George Kittle, just because it was so different than what you saw on tape. And it sort of showed you the whole new dynamic of what he can do.
Cool. Well, let's talk about defensive players. Kittle is going to be interesting in terms of where he ends up going, just because of his ability to explode into everyone's radar. But let's talk about defensive players. We already started talking about corners a little bit. It is a very interesting cornerback class. Lot of length. Oh my God, so much length. And a lot of talent too. Like, it's not just hey, there's a bunch of Stanley and Jean Baptiste here. There's a lot of talent. It seems like. I guess we'll find out sort of in 3 years, but a lot of talent and a lot of athleticism. And it seems like over the past couple of years, we've seen more athleticism at the defensive back position overall, both at safety and a cornerback. We'll talk about the safety class right after this, but let's talk about the cornerbacks. There's a lot of guys here. Who do you like from a Slytic's perspective, and who do you think will outperform, the Slytic's grade that you might have ended up giving them?
Yeah, so Kevin King is the first guy I want to bring up. Just crazy.
Is it because you're from the area? Is that why, or?
Well, yeah, and that has. I mean, he was on my connecting flight back through Minnesota the other day, and they say he runs a 4.44 at the combine. I think he ran a 4.2 trying to make the connecting flight. So, at 6'3", he's a true 6'3". At 200 pounds, got long arms. The agility things he ran a 3.89 short shuttle. That is fantastic. That is
nosebleed good. That's really good.
And he's and at his size, that's incredible. I mean, I think that was the most surprising number I saw at the combine was that 3.89 next to Kevin King's name. It's almost. I was really high on Kevin King's tape. He's a little bit grabby. There's no question, but he's physical. He's got great ball skills. The ceiling is the limit. I mean, the ceiling is tremendous there. And
do you, for a guy like Kevin King, where he's on a team full of incredibly talented defenders, and obviously this applies to people from Alabama in some way, and in some way also Michigan, but I think more for Kevin King because a lot of that talent is in the secondary. How do you have the ability to evaluate his tape? From my understanding, Sidney Jones tended to follow the top receiver. You've got Budda Baker, who has the ability to really make it make your day a lot easier. And then you've got a front that, especially while I think Mathis played for them, I think while Mathis was there, could get pressure. But just in general, you've got a pretty good front that allows you to have to deal with the ball coming quicker, which is good for a cornerback. What do you do with a guy like Kevin King, who was the second corner on his team, but second to a guy that a lot of people even like in the first round?
Yeah, absolutely. There's no question there's a lot of talent around him. And I wouldn't say it made his life easier because of the way their scheme works in Washington is the corners are sort of islands. They play to their strengths. I mean, that's sort of what they built their defensive scheme on. So King didn't get a lot of help over the top at times. They would play a lot of cover one. And those two, Jones and King, would be asked to do a lot. Because that was where their strengths were, and you'd see a lot of obscure blitzes and things like that, and interesting fronts. Washington doesn't really have true pass rushers. Joe Mathis was sort of the only one they had. They have like 3 defensive tackles they put on the front, and they blitz them. And it's sort of an interesting look. They got 3 big guys pass rushing. And when Mathis got hurt, it was really interesting what they did schematically. They basically went 3-2 with a bunch of DBs and would blitz the DBs. So like a 5-man box. Because the guys they had in the front 7, the injuries and the lack of depth there, they really went to they just sort of attacked the coverage aspect of it because they had so many bodies there. But yeah, Kevin King and Sidney Jones are both great prospects. I think they're both going to have first round or early second round grades for me in that range. It would be top 15 on my board, probably both of them. And the bias is clearly there, but I haven't been high on all the Washington guys over the past couple years. I did like Peters. I was a little bit lower on Shaq Thompson. So it's not like I have a bleeding bias, but I do really think for the scheme, what they asked to do, they both did a tremendous job. Sidney Jones, you barely even saw him on tape. He was just a lockdown guy, and you didn't see more King, but.
Here's a second question then. So one, this is driven in part by the fact that I think Sidney Jones probably had a disappointing combine, but 2, is this a situation where just because of how good Kevin King's combine is this a situation where a guy is better than the guy above him on the depth? Like, the guy might be better in the NFL than the guy who is above him on the depth chart in college? Like, and this doesn't happen a lot, but people were kind of talking about it when they were going crazy over Kenyon Drake versus like freaking Derrick Henry, or other situations. Like, do you think that this is a situation where we may end up with Kevin King is a better NFL prospect than Sidney Jones, or do you think that maybe not so much?
I think it sort of depends on what the scheme they end up in. Because Kevin King's going to be very scheme dependent. He's going to be one of those guys that needs to be in sort of the cover two press man sort of looks. And Sidney Jones is a lot more scheme agnostic. He's going to work almost anywhere. He can track guys. He can play in zone. Kevin King's going to be a little bit more scheme, but I think the ceiling's a lot higher on King if you put him in the right scheme. Seattle would be a great fit for him. Kansas City would be an interesting spot across from Peters. I think
that would be fun.
Yeah, that would be really fun. And with Eric Berry back there, ooh. Yeah, I don't think we should think about that. It's scary. But yeah, there's a lot to like with that duo, and it's sort of thing where you sort of get into a tough thing when evaluating teammates. Who belongs over who on the board. And for me as an evaluator, I try to just forget about it. Forget that they're teammates almost, because it becomes such a you sort of get in your own head about, this guy was better than this guy on the field, and how can I have him over him on the board? And you kind of just have to remove that aspect of it. I remember last year they had Jordan Jenkins and Leonard Floyd were teammates, and I had a big problem with putting one over the other on the board early in the process, because Jenkins is a more productive pass rusher, but Floyd had a lot more of the traits you look for in terms of development. Right. And so that was a tough thing to do, and you just sort of have to remove that, I think, from the process, because you can just sort of get in your own head.
No, that makes sense. Were there any other corners that stood out to you? Because again, for example, I love Marshawn Lattimore, his tape, his coverage numbers. The fact that we have access to college coverage numbers now is extraordinary. But his coverage numbers are some of the best I've ever seen. Obviously, not a ton of history for me to say the best I've ever seen, but I'm guessing it's going to be the best I'll see for a while. His tape is great. I thought his workout was pretty good. What do you think?
Yeah, no, he's somebody that's in the top 5 of people's boards right now, and I think the workout solidified a lot of that. I'm excited to really get in and finalize his tape just because of all the hype. I've seen him live a little bit. It certainly looked intriguing. Obi Melifonu obviously tested really well. Mm-hmm. He went and blew it up at his height. And another guy
he's a pretty polarizing prospect. A lot of people think that his tape is so bad that his athleticism can only put him at best in the 4th round. And there's some people who think his tape alone is first-round quality, and his athleticism kind of pushes him over the top and puts him in sort of the Malik Hooker or Jamal Adams territory in terms of where you want to draft him. He's a super polarizing prospect, so the fact that he tested well, I don't think it surprises anyone, because people have been talking about how he was going to test well, and UConn guys I guess they just test well.
Shout out to the strength and conditioning coach.
Yeah, right. What do you think about Melifonu? Because safety is a position that the Vikings, probably should care a lot about. Fans care a lot about. Maybe it's less of a need than fans have been talking about, just because Anderson Davis finally put together a pretty acceptable year. But it's still something we're interested in. So what do you think about Melifonu?
I think that you talk about the discrepancy in how he's graded. I think a lot of that is because he's trait backwards. You see the big size and you think he's going to be a thumper. And that's not really where he wins. He doesn't really play that way. He's more of a deep coverage guy, and with his traits, that's not really where people project him. And I think that's sort of what causes the big discrepancy, because they're looking for this big, thumper Keanu Neal type guy, and that's not what he is. And he's more of a I think of a coverage guy, and I think he'd really work well in that Vikings scheme because of how versatile and they want their safeties to be in terms of Melifonu can slide in and blitz and cover tight end, and he can drop back and play cover 1 or cover 2. So I really like that fit. He just won't be available at their pick. I mean, that's the issue there. I think he'll be way long gone when they're picking in the 2nd round.
Yeah, it sounds like there's definitely going to be 3 safeties gone by then: Jamal Adams, Malik Hooker, and probably Obi Melifonu. I don't know if there's going to be another safety, but people have been talking about the various safeties that they like. Josh Jones from North Carolina State may have tested himself into the 2nd round. There's also I guess what the BC guy probably didn't test that well, but there's also Marcus Williams at Utah who was only targeted 15 times last year, and it wasn't because he played 40 yards off the line of scrimmage. And he was only targeted 14 times the year before, so it's not even that much of a fluke. His coverage numbers, consequently, are very good. And he tested just insanely well. So what do you think about him?
he tested great. I mean, he jumped 43.5 inches, which at safety is just crazy. He was a playmaker at Utah. Every time they would play, I watched a lot of Pac-12 this year, and he clearly was a guy that held together their scheme, and that's a good defense there in Utah, and he was very important to what they were doing from a schematic perspective. His combine was great. Big guy, 202, long. I saw some whispers that he might have even tested himself into maybe converting to corner, which would be interesting. I don't think that's a smart move in this class because there's a lot more corners and safeties, but he does have the baseline measurables to at least consider that move.
Okay. That's kind of interesting. Isn't that like sort of that's the Josh Shaw question, although he did actually play corner. That's the Eric Rowe question.
Yeah, the Eric Rowe question for sure.
Yeah. Byron Jones, I guess, also kind of, although he also played corner. What do you think about, does Marcus Williams, because his numbers suggest that he's mostly a free safety, but with the highlight tape, so who knows? The highlights that I saw of him, because I haven't seen tape on him yet, the highlights that I saw of him suggest that he's actually a very versatile guy.
Arif, highlights. Yeah, he is very versatile. But don't you're not allowed to talk about highlights, Arif. That's not real.
Sorry. Don't exist.
No, yeah, he's very versatile. They moved him all around, and that's why I think when I overheard the Marcus Williams to corner thing when I was walking around in Indy. I didn't see that on tape, but that is something that had buzz, and that was sort of surprising to me because of how versatile he is. I think you can kind of use him as a safety in the slot, and he offers a lot more, especially for the Vikings, right? They could use somebody like that a lot. With so many corners in this class, I don't think we need to get creative on how to find more. You got guys like a Kilo Witherspoon that nobody's talking about, 6'2", runs a 4.45, got 33-inch arms, and jumps out of the gym. And nobody's talking about him. And I don't think we need to get more creative in moving safeties over, but it is something. There's some buzz there. It'll be interesting to see. It is tough too. You talk about class strength. Things can get changed very quickly with a team. That feels a way about a guy, and they bring him in, and their depth chart's barren there, and all of a sudden, Marcus Williams is one of their better options at corner. So it's tough to evaluate it all in a vacuum. But in this class, I'm not looking to convert Williams.
Cool. Well, let's move on from defensive backs real quick. The Vikings don't really need edge rushers, but they'll always grab one, either in the mid or at the end of day 3. What edge rushers from that perspective? So not Myles Garrett, who tested pretty well, I hear, or any of those guys. But what edge rushers do you think that are projected to go in the mid to late rounds tested well enough for the Vikings, because they pretty much only get guys who test well?
Yeah. Without the first-round pick, a lot of the premier options are going to be gone. Tano Passano kind of fits their mold in terms of big, long, tested well. There's some second-round buzz on him as well, and I don't think the Vikings want to be using their first pick on another edge rusher.
Right.
So he might be off the board. In terms of like a day 3 guy, Al-Quadin Muhammad from Miami AQM, as we call him, did not test well at all.
Yeah, I was about to say, I don't think he tested well.
No, tested very poorly, and for a guy that was really inconsistent on tape and was expected to come in and blow it up, that really hurt him. And I don't think he's draftable at this point. And there's not a lot of edge depth in this class, I don't think, personally. Like day 3 depth. I think day 2 there's some good depth. And Jordan Willis obviously tested through the roof.
Right, so I was going to ask a question about Jordan Willis. So, there's 2 guys that were ultra productive in weak conferences and also tested really well. Jordan Willis tested amazingly well, and then Trey Hendrickson also tested pretty well.
And Derek Rivers, I'd even throw him in there.
Yeah.
He's
getting like second-round hype too, so who knows? But with guys like Willis, who could be drafted in the 2nd round because of his tests, or in the 5th round because people just don't like his tape, a guy like Trey Hendrickson, who might be 5th, 6th, 7th round. Do you think those guys would be worthy additions to the Vikings pass rushing core?
I think Willis will be long gone by the Vikings. He's getting first-round buzz right now with how he tested. People in Indy were hyped. I mean, he was the talk of Indy, how he tested. I don't see him being available even in the Vikings 2nd-round pick. And as we talked about, they're going to be looking for day 3 guys. The guy that was interesting for me was Pito Toyampena. I'm butchering that, but from Utah. Really lean edge rusher at 243, but had long arms, tested pretty well. Guy I wasn't really familiar with, even though I'd watched a lot of Pac-12. Hadn't seen a lot of him. Didn't jump great, but the agility stuff is where he sort of stood out. He could be an interesting guy for them on day 3 out of Utah. Was not really impressed with Garrett Sickles. Didn't see, he's sort of the bigger 260 type. Maybe you put him at 5-tech in terms of setting the edge on the edge as a run defender. But didn't look very good in the drills. Jumped horribly. Didn't see a lot there with him. Like I said, it's with the edge rusher class is really after day 2 there's not a lot of intriguing day 3 guys. So I don't know if this is really the class for the Vikings to really take a developmental guy. Trey Hendrickson is an interesting name for how he tested, and he did well at the East-West game as well. But one thing I heard about him throughout the week was sort of the IQ and the mental processing side really struggles to pick up concepts. And that was something I heard from the East-West Shrine game and in Indy. So that's obviously not going to hurt him on the board. The pass rushers, they're not asked to know a lot of things, but
right.
They that's not really a position where mental processing is vital, but it's still important from a schematic perspective. I don't think he'd be a great fit in a 3-4. Yeah, he's not going to be a great fit in a 3-4 because he's not going to be able to drop back into coverage as well. At 266, he's not going to be the Ahmad Brooks type where he can cover and set the edge well as a run defender in the 34 defense. But for the Vikings in the scheme they run, I could see him being a pick late for sure.
Cool. And I know, this is a pretty rote show. We're just going position by position. But the Vikings just had Chad Greenway retire, and Mike Zimmer mentioned that hey, Emmanuel Lamore or Edmund Robinson. By the way, Edmund Robinson tested extremely well. Lamore tested pretty well. He's confident that one of them can step up. But the Vikings also draft a linebacker every year. They draft usually a special teams guy. Last year was Kentrell Brothers, who tested, obviously pretty poorly because he was small and slow. But he was a special teams guy. They tend to draft like these guys that run fast and are kind of undersized at the end. People like Brandon Watts, Larry Dean, sort of in the 6th, 7th round, or injury guys like Michael Amati. Are there any guys at linebacker, maybe Alex Anzalone, for example, who I don't even think Anzalone was at the combine, but I wasn't paying attention a lot.
Oh no, he was. He tested.
He was?
Yeah.
How did he test? That's because he's supposed to be an athletic.
Yeah, he tested well.
Okay, cool. Well, who are the linebackers that you think 5th, 6th, 7th round tested really well that might be fits for the Vikings to grab a special teams guy?
Yeah, Anzalone was the first name I was going to mention. He tested probably the best among the linebackers. Didn't test well as a group. Him and Ty Bowser probably tested the best. But I think both those guys are going to be. If you're looking for a 5th, 6th round guy, I think both those guys are going to be gone. Anzalone killed it at the Senior Bowl. He did really well. Obviously, the medical is the big question there. It's tough to know from the outside what his situation is. Bowser, he's a pure projection. He'll be long gone. In the range you're looking at, because people see him as an edge rusher. The tape doesn't really show you that, and he's changed his body too. He weighed in at 247. He played at 233. So he's really changed his body, and he tested really well with his new weight. So that's impressive.
That is pretty interesting.
Yeah.
He also dropped back in coverage more than I think any other edge rusher.
No, he wasn't an edge rusher for Houston. Yeah. In my opinion. He was an off-ball guy. And he wants to play edge rusher, and that's what he's training for. Is he thinks that's where his best fit is long term. But he's just such a pure projection on tape because you didn't see those reps from him.
Yeah, fair enough. And then the Vikings are looking for potentially a long-term replacement for Sharif Floyd, who Mike Zimmer is essentially sick of. In terms of his injury history and stuff like that, they had to platoon Tom Johnson and Jamar Stephen there at 3 technique, and this is an interesting, I think, tackle class. But I don't know if it's going to be deep enough for them to be able, because that's essentially a luxury pick given that the Vikings need 1, 2, or 3 offensive linemen in the draft, and maybe would even want a safety safety and a running back before they grab a defensive tackle. But still, an interesting defensive tackle class, right? Who do you think? Based off of, either the film or the testing, is somebody that'd be interesting, either as a versatile 3 technique / 1 technique, or as a 3 technique overall, that you might be able to grab sort of in the middle rounds. Because the only name I'm coming up with right now is the UCLA guy, Eddie Vanderhoos.
Yeah, he would be an interesting name. I was really disappointed with the defensive tackle class in general. Some people think it's a solid class. I'm way down on it. I'm not sure Jaleel Johnson's draftable based on how he tested.
Jesus.
Yeah,
it's gonna make Chuck sad.
So some of the ran the worst 10-yard split ever among defensive tackles for his weight ever. I mean, he ran like he weighs 380 and he weighs 316. So he's off the board for me as sort of that. That's where he plays, is that 3 tech, and he's one of the premier prospects at that position. The only name I can think of in terms of a late guy for the Vikings would be DJ Jones out of Mississippi. He was really the only guy that didn't test horribly among the defensive tackles. Jumped 28.5 inches. That's pretty good for that position. Ran pretty well. The 1.76 split was nice. It's a pessimistic group. Naz Jones didn't test well from North Carolina. There's not a lot of guys, but DJ Jones could be an interesting fit. Weighs 319, can kind of slide between 1 and 3 tech in the Vikings defense. It should be there in like the 5th or 6th round, I think. He could be a guy, and I did like his tape as well when I did watch it. Not a explosive one-gap penetrator, but in terms of a guy that can do well with his run fits and step down at the right time in terms of read and react ability. He's a guy that can step in there and be a rotational guy, I think, for them.
Cool. And then before we sort of wrap everything up, just real quick, now that we've gotten sort of over like basically every position at the Combine, if you had ideal picks for the Vikings in the 2nd, 3rd, and, 2 4th-round picks, I know I'm putting you on the spot, and that's like a lot to process at once, but we just went through a bunch of people. Who do you think would be the ideal picks for the Vikings? 2, 3, 4, or 4?
All right, 2nd round, I'm sticking with Antonio Garcia. Sure. I think that's the right fit for them. A little bit of a reach probably in their 2nd round pick, but the tackle is going to be the premium in this class, and I could see someone even trying to trade up ahead of the Vikings to steal him if they fall in love. But he's really smooth out of his kick, could offer a lot, and they need someone on the left side. I do not think T.J. Clemens is the answer.
I don't think anyone does.
Yeah, I don't think. Yeah, real hot take there for me, but I think Garcia can be that guy in terms of a developmental guy in the 2nd round that can come in day one, and you hope that as he develops on the go. And in the 2nd round, in the 3rd round, I would like to see them grab that safety. I would like to see a guy, maybe even they can go with three safety looks. Justin Evans out of Texas A&M was a guy I liked on tape. Did not test at the Combine. So I'll be curious to watch his.
We think he's probably going to test well right at his pro day.
Yeah, absolutely. It'll be interesting to see how that transfers through, and he'll be a 2nd, 3rd round guy. If he falls to the 3rd round pick, I think that's a great value, and sort of capitalizing on the strength of the draft class with the DBs. I think that would be a great pick for them in the 3rd, and in the 4th, they probably need to go back to the offensive line. Get a guard guy that can come in and compete with guys like Kush off the table in terms of bringing him in. I like Will Holden. We talked about him a lot in terms of having tackle guard versatility, and I think that's something the Vikings really need. If Will Holden's there in the 4th, he could be a great option for them in terms of.
He played really well at guard in the Senior Bowl, but when you put on his tackle tape at Vanderbilt, it's like, I don't know.
You're right. Yeah, his translation to guard was surprising.
Phenomenal.
Yeah, I think he was the best interior pass protector at the Senior Bowl. He was only there for a practice in the game, but he dominated in the game, and the practice was like phenomenal. And we were all oohing and on up there about Will Holden. If he's there in the 4th, sliding him in at guard and having him be an emergency tackle, I don't think is gonna. I think that's a great fit for the Vikings.
Cool. And then the other 4th round pick, maybe a center, maybe a running back. What do you got?
Yeah, 4th round. I like the running back idea. I think that's capitalizing on the strength of the class once again. I like, here's a name not really talked about as much, but Elijah McGuire out of Louisiana Lafayette. Think he could really complement Jerick McKinnon well. Tested pretty well. Sort of a guy I could pull up my notes on him here. He's got good size, he's athletic, he's got nice initial burst, solid hands. One thing he does is he shows really good flashes at downhill runner, sort of that between the tackles guy that complements McKinnon well, He does kick outside a lot in terms of, when he doesn't see the hole, his first reaction is just to kick out. The change of direction is not really where he wins, but in terms of saying north to south, could complement McKinnon really well. And in terms of the fourth round, probably a little bit of a reach, but I have him graded as sort of a fifth round guy. But in terms of finding the right fit for McKinnon, I think he's the best complement to him.
Okay. So with all of that in mind, how do you think that this draft class will play out, given what the Vikings need? Because they've got a weakness sort of at a position where the draft is weak at tackle, but they've also got some weaknesses at positions where you could grab a lot of value. Running back, maybe guard, definitely safety. Do you think that the Vikings will probably come away with a pretty good draft based off of the strength of the class and what the Vikings' needs are?
Yeah, when we talked about like the third and fourth round, finding that running back and that safety, I think that there's going to be a ton of value there. And that's where they can capitalize with that. I think the biggest thing for them is, can they get Antonio Garcia in the second round? Because there's just not a lot of other tackle options around in the draft class. And unless they want to go out and pay somebody,
right.
It seems like
do you think it's worth sacrificing a pick to trade up within the second round, in order to secure Antonio Garcia?
I think it would be. I think that's a situation I'd be very comfortable with. Moving up 6 and moving up 5 or a couple slots to just solidify. Even if it is a bit of a reach, just because the floor between Garcia and the next guy is just it's massive in my opinion.
Okay. Well, Dusty, do you have any questions? Are you there, Dusty?
Not. Well, I mean, yes, I'm here.
We put Dusty to sleep.
I don't. No, I've been actually listening and taking notes like a good student would. I have a couple of questions from the mailbag that I can substitute for my own.
Yeah, let's pretend they're yours and then attribute to them the people who they actually are.
These may not be specifically Combine-related questions, just so you know.
Whatever.
Draft-wise, though,
only.
Eric the Viking writes in with a question on Twitter. At 48, would a tight end that's left be better or more potential than Ruddy? He has no guarantee after 17.
Oh, yeah, I guess. You probably have a tight end with more potential than Rudy. I don't know if that's a wise decision, though. What do you think, Ethan?
Who's are you talking? Who's Rudy? I don't know nickname.
It's Rudy. It's Kyle Rudolph.
Okay, I assumed so, but I didn't know if Red Ellison had a weird nickname. Yeah, no, we talked about Jake Butt. I don't think in the second round with their tackle need, they probably need that more. I think that's what they should target. But yeah, I think a tackle or a tight end late would be a nice pickup for them.
All right. What's the bigger priority? Maybe Arif will have specific insight to this one. Bigger priority right now: tackle or right guard?
Well, I did. We did mention this a little bit, just because of the nature of the markets. Tackle is definitely a bigger priority in terms of where you want to invest your resources, because I think that you can get a lot of value at guard. But pretty sure that's.
Well,
pretty sure that's the only answer.
A little bit in the past about how a player can go from tackle to guard, but it's harder to go from guard to tackle. Is that? Am I getting that right?
That seems to be like sort of the consensus understanding. I personally think Boone could be an even better tackle than he is a guard. He's already a pretty good guard, but I think that generally speaking, it is more difficult to move from guard to tackle. So that's a good point. That's a good way to like sort of counterbalance the nature of the market. Is that, well, if you get a tackle, you might also actually end up with a guard. I still think that the primary reason is the resource scarcity argument, but also I think that that kind of makes a lot of sense. If you target a tackle and he doesn't work out, you might still have a guard.
Are there any scenarios where the Vikings pick up 0 offensive linemen in free agency and the draft, and the Twin Cities are not burned to the ground?
No. MSP wouldn't be there next time I came in town.
Nope, a smoking hole, to be sure. And lastly, also from Tommy Gunn, it only took 4 seasons, but Chad Greenway is finally out of the picture. Who is next on Arif's hit list, and how long will it take?
Oh, man. I don't hate Chad. I just, it's good for him that he retired.
Who else would it be good for if they retired?
Well, I think Adrian deserves a long and healthy retirement, but I guess that's being forced on him.
We don't want him